Well, there was a turning point, but actually the interest originated a long time ago. As a student, I was interested in economics. That was my degree. I was particularly interested in development economics. What is it that helps poor countries become richer, and how do you deal with global poverty? That was where I started, and I worked in Africa, Latin America, India. But the turning point was when I was in Shell. I was their chief economist and responsible for scenario planning, and I was sent out to China to make some advice on whether Shell should put lots of money into China. And then I was sent to India to do the same exercise. And we came down in favor of making big investments in both places. But I got a feel for some of the dynamism there in both countries. India I'd known better because my late wife was from India and I was going there frequently, but it was my first experience of China. And when I came back, I wrote a pamphlet for Chatham House, which was a comparison of China and India at that point. And now, 25, almost 30 years later, I want to look back at what I'd written then and the phenomenal progress that both countries have made. India is now one of the major countries in the world. China is a superpower. And also look forward. You know, if so much can happen in 25 years, what could happen in the next 25 years? So the turning point was really visiting both countries with a business hat on, seeing the phenomenal growth and seeing where it could lead. Well, I think I was trying to avoid using the term superpower because that has all kind of military connotations. And I was looking at it from the point of view of economies. And there are some countries, India is a classic example, which if you look at the size of their economy measured properly in terms of what economists call purchasing power parity, takes out the complication of exchange rates. And India is up there as a major power, far bigger than the UK, for example. So I wanted a term that captured the fact that many emerging economies in particular are becoming major forces in the world. I mean, India is the obvious case, but Brazil, Saudi, Turkey, Indonesia is another. And these are countries that are becoming what I would call superstate. We've got 200 countries in the world. Many of them are very, very small, but there are some that have major economic weight. And that is going to become important in the kind of rather fragmented world that we live in, with Trump destroying the system of rules. Being big has advantages. I didn't expect to have to say this, but big is beautiful in this rather anarchic world that we seem to be heading into. Well, strange as it might seem, I mean, potentially two or three biggest economies in the world have very little relationship. It's distant, it's suspicious. India and China fought a war back in 1962. India was actually humiliated. The balance has become a little bit better since. They haven't fought, but there's an undercurrent of suspicion. There have been clashes along the border. And in a way, more seriously, China has made itself an ally of Pakistan. And in the recent conflict, Chinese advanced fighter jets were being used by the Pakistanis, and apparently very successfully, in comparison with the Indians' French fighters. So there is this history of military conflict, and potentially you're dealing with two potential superpowers, both with nuclear weapons, very dangerous. And of course, Pakistan as another element in that story. Economically, there isn't a great deal of trade between them, not a great deal of investment, and it's rather one-sided. China exports quite a lot to India. India hardly exports anything to China. And one of the big questions in India now is how far we should use Chinese technology and Chinese investment to promote growth, even though it's one-sided and even though there is a strategic dimension to all of this. Well, it is changing the geopolitical picture a great deal. I mean, there is a possibility that we could get into, and it's not just Trump, and this goes back to Biden, where you get a picture of what I describe in the book as something what I call a global West, that effectively the Americans get much of the rest of the world behind them against China and its allies, which include Russia. So the United States with Europe and crucially with India, you could have a very divided world along that kind of axis. But Trump's peculiarities, which include being very aggressive towards your friends, probably even more than towards your enemies, may produce a much more fragmented and uncertain world, which some people call multipolar, and the Indians, I describe in this book, called multi-alignment, where you have several major powers jostling for influence, spheres of influence in certain geographical areas. And it's a rather dangerous world because when you have that kind of competition, nobody's taking responsibility for the big global issues like stopping nuclear proliferation or the climate change challenge, global pandemics. Somebody has to take a lead, and it's historically been the Americans, but in a more fragmented world where the Americans are relatively less important, who leads? So I discuss these various outcomes, potentially a global West, what could it mean? Potentially a fragmented multipolar world. There isn't a good outcome to either of them, but we need to think through where they might lead. Well, we're already beginning to see it if Trump is a sort of manifestation of this new world. I mean, the simple fact is that although the US economy has done extremely well in the Western world, I mean, it's been growing far faster than the UK or Western Europe or Japan, in global terms, many of the big emerging markets, and particularly China and India, have been growing far more rapidly, and therefore their weight in the world economy has become much bigger, and US influence has been relatively declining. And this even in fairly benign periods, with Obama and Biden, and now Trump, by declaring "Make America Great Again," seems potentially to be having the opposite effect. That in several respects, the United States is now falling quite badly behind, certainly in manufacturing, potentially in key technologies with the Chinese, not yet the Indians. The one big thing they have going for them is they have a global currency, which gives it a kind of stranglehold over the world monetary system. But that now is potentially going to be eroded and potentially broken in a spectacular way by Trump's misadventures. So the effect of all that could mean that the world economy becomes less orderly, less predictable, more uncertain. Supply chains tend to be broken up. And you can't help but believe that this is actually going to slow the world down. Many of the benefits that we've all enjoyed over the last 50 years or so will be less evident. So for ordinary people, we may be looking at a more difficult world where the traditional conveyor belt of rising living standards doesn't happen anymore. We have growing risks of conflict, where problems like climate change begin to start running out of control. And if you're a member of the public, then actually these are not necessarily catastrophic, but they're certainly very worrying. Well, you first of all start by acknowledging that the world in 20 years' time will be very different from what it is today. It's very likely, it's not absolutely certain, that we'll, in 25 years, we'll be living in a world with three superpowers, not just the United States, but China and India. And I'm taking a bit of punt on India's success being sustained. So it is a very different world. How is UK, as a relatively middle-sized country with shrinking influence, how do we deal with that? Well, I think, and I'm here betraying my own political prejudices, but I really do think we need to be much closer to the European Union, whether we're talking about rejoining or some new arrangement. It's absolutely fundamental because in this kind of world, as a country of Britain's size, you're in a very weak and exposed position, and we can no longer rely on the protection of the United States or the stability that was provided by global rules. Those may not exist in future. So bargaining power will matter, and Britain doesn't have a great deal of it.